Joining me for the first episode of Full Disclosure is, it's an overused phrase, a man who needs no introduction, but if anybody doesn't know who Tony Blair is, then they're watching or listening to the wrong project. Can we begin at the end, if we may? When people download this, we'll be 3.5 weeks away from Brexit, away from the actual date. Could you explain to someone who hasn't been paying attention how we've ended up 3.5 weeks away from it without knowing what it means?
Yeah, we've basically ended up in this position because there's a fundamental disagreement inside the cabinet, not just the government, not just Parliament, which is a disagreement about whether, even if we do Brexit, do we do it in a hard way or a soft way? And those are two fundamentally different types of Brexit. The cabinet is basically split on it, and therefore we've all the way through the negotiation, what the government's been trying to do is do what's called the cake and eat it strategy of saying, yep, we can keep all the advantages of being part of the European trading system, but without the disadvantage of abiding by the rules of that system. This was always going to be impossible, has been impossible throughout, and we're in this situation today basically because that is the unresolved issue at the heart of it. What the Prime Minister now wants to do is to leave with that issue unresolved, because that is the simplest way
in the short term.
In the short term, to get everyone on the same page. But of course, what it means is that her deal, because it doesn't have clarity, won't bring closure.
Could it have unfolded any differently? And if not, at what point did what's happening now become inevitable?
Yeah, it could have unfolded differently. But she chose, and look, I understand the reasons for this, and I'm not personally unsympathetic to her at all, by the way, but she basically decided that her job was just to deliver Brexit, and finally, as things went on, to deliver it in whatever form, because I think she personally favoured a soft Brexit, but couldn't get it through her cabinet. It unfolded this way, but it could have unfolded in a different way, where in a sense she laid out the options. Because at one level, this has been a negotiation over how we withdraw from the European Union. What money do we pay up front? What are the rights of EU citizens here now? That's all perfectly good stuff for a negotiation. But the future relationship between Britain and Europe has never been a negotiation in its essence. It's been a choice, hard or soft. Hard means you get out of the European trading system. In other words, you leave not just the political union of Europe, but the economic union that was created around the single market and the customs arrangements. If you do that, that's a hard Brexit, because you then become a country like Canada's just signed a free trade agreement with Europe. But that's a big change for British industry and business and the financial sector and all the other parts of the service sector who've been trading for decades on the basis we're part of this trading system. That's the hard Brexit, and that's painful. Or alternatively, you can say, look, we're going to leave the political side of Europe, but we're going to stay in those economic arrangements. But then the risk is you become a rule taker. So
it's not a risk, it's a reality.
Yeah, reality. Yeah, you're right. So in those circumstances, it's the kind of pointless Brexit.
And we become then the country that leavers told voters we already were when they were trying to persuade them to leave.
Correct. And you become like Norway. And, if you talk actually to any Norwegian politician privately, they will advise you strongly not to go down that path. But she could have, as it were, set out the options and then said, look, I'm going to try and guide you as to whether it's hard, soft, or actually do you want to rethink?
And that would have raised the prospect of a rethink much earlier than she would have been comfortable with. Yeah, do you think there is going to be a rethink?
I think it's possible, but I think
of course it's possible. Do you think it's likely?
Likely, on an optimistic day, yes. And on a pessimistic day, no.
In the sky.
I mean, it's really hard to judge, because I think what will happen is that the hardline Brexiteers, you see, I think their strategy will be eventually to collapse and go along with her deal, because they think they can win the subsequent argument and they think they can get rid of her as leader. Obviously, this will happen. And then I think what they will try to do is have a hard Brexiteer in charge of the next stage of negotiation. I think there's every possibility they get that because of the way the membership of the Conservative Party's also shifted. And then, frankly, we'll be in for a hard Brexit.
We'll have to wait and see. In your less optimistic moments, do you think that we wouldn't be here at all if you hadn't miscalculated how many Eastern European people would come here after their countries acceded to the EU?
So I don't know that that's the decisive factor.
But it's enough in such a tight vote, though.
Yeah, but look, back then in 2004, I think, just to explain the situation, the decision. So the moment these countries join, they have freedom of movement. What they didn't necessarily have was the freedom to work. You could have postponed that for 7 years. I mean, look, I personally don't think these people coming in did damage to our economy. In fact, I think you can make the opposite case. But, if I'd still been in power after 2007, I noticed this was becoming a big issue. For example, I think some people do feel with some justification that there was an undercutting of wages when you brought in cheaper labor from Eastern Europe, for example. I would have been acting on it. But I don't, honestly, I don't think that's I think if you'd held a referendum at any point in the last 30 to 40 years, you might have lost it. But, I was never in favor of holding it.
Why not?
Because I think holding a referendum, if you're the government and you want consent for a change, supposing you're going to change the kind of constitutional arrangements, that is, understandable. I'm not in favor of referendums as a way of governing in general terms, but I can see the case for doing that if you as a government want to alter the constitutional arrangements. What is truly odd about this situation is that we held a referendum in circumstances where the government didn't want to alter. They wanted the status quo. And therefore your risk is enormous, because if people vote against what you're doing, you're then saddled with something you genuinely think is contrary to the public interest.
Could a more effective opposition have altered some of the things you've just described? In the context more of the post-referendum Theresa May's cakeism, could a more effective opposition have played a bigger role?
Yeah, for sure.
How?
By laying out the options and taking a clear position.
Well, they'd been denied, though, wouldn't it? As soon as anybody, whether in politics or the media, said these are the only options, you would still have had the unicornists, for want of a better word, saying, no, if you only believe enough. And that's really what's broken everything, isn't it? The blind faith. It's
true, but, I don't think we put a very vigorous... I think the Labour Party, and I understand the reasons for this, and I'm not being, excessively critical about this, but I think they thought constructive ambiguity was a smart thing to do politically. I always thought it would end in destructive indecision, and I think that is what has happened. I think we've lost people from the Remain side who think we're not really fighting the case, and we've probably lost people from the Leave side now who think we're not really backing Brexit. So, my view all the way through on this issue, you can't calculate what is the politically smart thing to do. And in circumstances where you can't calculate what is politically smart, just go with what you actually believe, because in the end, at least you feel comfortable about it.
Do you know what the Labour Party's position is precisely on Brexit at the moment?
I think the Labour Party's position is, there are those maybe better able to describe it than me, but I think it actually is relatively clear now, which is to propose a soft Brexit, and if that's rejected, to propose another referendum.
Do you think you should have kept your head down during the referendum campaign because of baggage that you bring to almost any public appearance now?
Well, during the referendum campaign, I did.
You were quiet, but you weren't silent.
Well, the only thing I did do was with John Major and Northern Ireland.
About the Irish border.
Yeah,
you got that wrong.
Yeah, exactly. We were told that, by the way, there was a complete nonsense and it was an easy problem to resolve, which it never was. No, I did keep my head down during the referendum. But once it happened, I decided I'm not going to keep my head down any longer, because I think it's a huge historic mistake for the country. And I think it's a mistake that future generations will look back on and say, why on earth did we do this? Because you see, I think there are economic reasons for staying in Europe, but I'm not one of these people who thinks that Britain leaves Europe, it's finished economically and so on. And no, of course, Britain's going to be a great country, whatever happens. We can rebuild out of it if we have to. But where I'm looking at the world right now, by the middle of this century, which is, by the time my grandchildren are the same age as my oldest kids now, this world is going to look so different to us. You are going to have a hugely dominant power in China, probably India, and certainly in the United States of America. Everyone else, the gap between those three and the fourth country is going to be enormous. The Chinese economy will be several times, maybe 8 times the size of the British economy, maybe more by that stage. In these circumstances, politically, to protect our interests, protect our values, Europe's essential for us. Otherwise, you're just going to get sat on. It's a new world out there. And there are changes that are happening that are so profound that for us to wrench ourselves out of the largest market and biggest political union, to which we are geographically joined, this is a kind of, it's like a top 6 Premiership side deciding to play in the Championship for the rest of their days.
Which oddly, a former head of the WTO has described a fairly similar analogy in describing what would happen to us if we did crash out exclusively on on those terms. Have you had any personal fractures in your relationships and friendships? Because you've been immersed in the political establishment for most of your adult life, and there's plenty of people who presumably you like and respect who jumped the other way in June 2016. Have you had any personal experience of those kind of enmities?
No, I mean...
Because everyone you know voted Remain.
No. Look, I was... my reference point for this is... when you're Prime Minister, you have one member of Parliament who kind of looks after you in parliamentary terms.
Right.
And I had the great pleasure of having someone called Bruce Grocott, who was a member of Parliament, as my sort of...
mentor.
Yeah, he was the guy who used to look after me in Parliament. Bruce has always been totally against Europe, completely against the European Union, ragingly in favour of Brexit. I would never fall out with him over it. I mean, I love the guy, and I think he's still a fantastic person. I just disagree with him. So I think it's...
When did you last speak to him?
A few months back.
And he's still on side, is he?
Oh, he's totally in favour of Brexit. I mean, there's no...
That's the most underreported constituency, isn't it? The sort of... The left-wing Brexiters.
Well, I think it's people of a certain generation.
Yes, the Tony Benn influence.
It's partly that on the left, and partly people who feel, we've lost our identity through going into Europe. We're less British than we were. And then I think it gets mixed in with a whole lot of other issues around immigration questions and so on. And then you have this extraordinary idea that we're not in charge of our own laws. Whereas, truthfully, the only laws we have, as it were, subcontracted is laws we do with the other 27 countries because they're part of this single market arrangement. And we do that because it makes it easier for us. And that's why, one of the things that's really bizarre is when, for example, Boris Johnson resigned as Foreign Secretary, he wrote a resignation letter, and this is a big thing to do. You resign, right? As Foreign Secretary. So what's the example he gives of why this is Europe's so terrible? It's something to do with the size of truck windows.
Yes.
He has to retreat to something that is, frankly, neither here nor there.
It was also fact-checked and found to be false, even in his resignation letter.
That is where you might kind of assume that. But what is so extraordinary is if we want to change the health service, we could abolish it or reinvigorate it. We can do whatever education reforms we want. We can put our taxes up. We can put them down. We can spend more. We can spend less. We could have Jeremy Corbyn. We could have Rees-Mogg. We could have whoever we want. Back in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher was fighting Michael Foot. Let's assume if Labour had won in 83, it would have been rather different. So the idea we're not in charge of our own laws, this is what's happened is that Europe has become the vehicle in which people express a lot of discontent that is really discontent about things we are in charge of. But it's all got, put on the shoulders of Europe.
But you speak, I'm sure you don't intend to, as if this environment existed only after 2007. You were Prime Minister for 10 years, while perhaps a lot of the worst misrepresentations of the European Union in particular, and Brussels as a sort of metaphor for what the European Union is, that's when it took hold, on your watch. The demonisation by newspapers and politicians alike of what the European Union represented. And none of this would be happening if it hadn't been successfully cast psychologically as an enemy of the British people. And that happened while you were in Downing Street.
Well, I think it happened before I was in Downing Street as well.
Well, it continued while you were in Downing Street. There's not this sort of 10-year window where it suddenly got put on hold.
I always feel, forgive me if I feel somewhat resentful when people say, well, it's your fault that Brexit happened when I never voted for it.
I didn't say it was your fault. I said that you were in charge of the country while the country fell into believing that the European Union was an enemy of its interests.
Well, I think, as I say, I think this was always a strain in our politics. And it went in, by the way, the odd thing was, and back in the early 80s, the Labour Party was against Europe.
Yes.
In 83, the Labour Party programme was to leave the European Union. And it was Margaret Thatcher that was staunchly defending the European Union. So these things go in cycles. Look, I always made the case for Europe. But I think, wherever you are in politics today and wherever you are in Europe, there's a strong anti-European feeling. But I always think it's for the leadership of the country to try and guide the country through and do what they think is
I suppose
best.
I'm asking whether you feel you should have put in a little bit more heavy lifting on portraying it as a more positive force.
Well, I tried to.
Did you?
Maybe I didn't succeed in the way that I would like to have. No, I think if you look back, and people often say, I used to go to Europe and make pro-Europe speeches, but not in Britain. But I used to point out to them, one, I did in Britain, and two, we live in a global media today. So if
It was up to them.
Right.
Well, then that actually leads to another question I'd like to hear your answer to, which is whether or not you feel in retrospect that you and Alistair Campbell tried a little bit too hard to keep certain elements of the press on side. I know that the obvious answer is we probably wouldn't have won elections without them, but if you look at somebody like Paul Dacre, for example, and his, to use that dreadful word, legacy, an awful lot of the problems we're discussing probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the editorial line of the Daily Mail.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, and it's a criticism I often think about.
Is it?
It's difficult though, because it's one thing to think about it 10 years after you left. It's
Yes.
another thing to think back 20 years when you were trying to get in.
Yes.
And we'd lost 4 elections in a row, and we were very conscious of the power of that right-wing media. But no, I often think about that, and what would have happened if you just ended up, but you'd have ended up in big opposition.
You could have been treated as they treated Ed Miliband and
Neil
now
Kinnock,
Jeremy
of course.
Corbyn.
People forget that Neil Kinnock was really
Absolutely turn the lights off, the last one to leave Britain.
So, I don't know. It's I think today
There was a bit of a deal with the devil then. And it's interesting to see the look on your face as you reflect on that. That's clearly a genuine sort of 3 o'clock in the morning moment where you think, did we bow down too low to Paul Dacre and Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to reflect on that. But it's easy, as I say, to say when you're not fighting a battle. And, we look, in although there were certain concessions you might say we made to that wing, we were still, there was never any doubt where the country stood on Europe. And even before the 97 election, I made it clear that we were not going to seek a position of isolation in Europe. And by and large, we didn't throughout the period of time. We actually, one of the tragedies of this situation is that certainly in my time, and I think even afterwards, we won most of the battles we fought in Europe. And one of the things that is sort of most strange to people from the European side is that, number one, the 2 things Britain always fought for in Europe, under Margaret Thatcher, under John Major, and then under myself, was number 1, single market, number 2, enlargement.
But she invented it effectively, didn't she?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, one of the oddest things about all of this is that the kind of 2 things that we really stood for are now, in a sense, the reason why people want out. They want out because we pay, the money that we pay to Europe, by the way, which is a small fraction of the public spending overall. The money we pay is basically so that those countries in Eastern Europe can lift their living standards up. And it's just worth pointing this out. I mean, our net contributions to Europe are roughly 8 billion a year. But for example, if you just take Poland alone, in 2004, our trade with Poland was under 4 billion. And today it's over 14 billion. So we have actually benefited from these countries raising their standard of living and prosperity. And now, of course, the wages in those countries have risen significantly. And that, by the way, along with Brexit, is one reason why there's not the same pressure coming on the migration side from Eastern Europe.
But these are the slightly complicated arguments that probably weren't made enough, because they're not that complicated. If you are an immigration obsessive, and perhaps one of Remain's failures was not to properly address immigration obsessives, you could argue that, as you just did, that the contributions we make migration from poorer countries to wealthier countries within the Union less likely. So, in fact, the more you pay, the more likely these people are to find jobs at home. Staying with regret and retrospection then, when you make pertinent, powerful points like that, how do you personally process the fact that many people listening to this or watching this now will, fairly or unfairly, they will dismiss everything you say because of the aftermath of the defeat of Saddam Hussein? The Iraq war hangs around your neck like an albatross, doesn't it?
Well, people can decide, to say, well, I'm not going to listen to him because of that, and that's their choice. I mean, I took a decision a few years back, particularly after the Brexit vote, that I really do passionately believe in this.
Yes.
And so, in the end, look, here's the deal. I can't make you listen, and you can't stop me speaking.
But it must be dispiriting, though, to have a shadow that's probably going to be cast very long and very dark over the rest of your life.
Well, it depends.
Do you deserve it?
It depends whether you think the decision's right or not, and that's another matter, or whether you think it's based on deceit or not, and that is also another matter, and I'm happy to go into those things.
Sure.
But in the end...
Well, I know what you think. You don't think it was built on deceit. So, no. and a lot of people still do, and perhaps that twain will never meet. But do you think it's fair that everything you do and say, probably for the rest of your life, is going to be distorted by the lens of Iraq?
I can't affect that one way or another.
But do you think it's fair?
I don't know if it's fair or unfair, but it
can't be much fun.
You know what I always think?
No.
I always think I am really blessed and lucky to have done what I've done, to have been Prime Minister for 10 years. And, one of the great things in life is actually to wake up every morning with a sense of purpose and go to bed at night counting your blessings. And so I don't have any, it's not that I think it's, fair or unfair whether people think like that. I understand why they think like that. It was a huge decision.
Sure.
And an agonizing decision to take, and you're put in place as Prime Minister to take those decisions. So you've got to live with it. And there's no point in asking whether it's just or unjust that you live with it. You do live with it. And so in a sense, you should.
I was interested in you as a person rather than you as a politician. The politician's answer is, of course, it is what it is, and you deal with it. But you're a human being. You mentioned a moment ago the stuff that kind of does perhaps animate you in your quieter moments. And that must be the biggest one of all, surely.
Yeah, of course, you reflect on it. But, the personal in this sense...
is the political.
Yeah.
Yes. That's a point people often miss, perhaps, when they're
and
sharpening their cudgels.
Yeah, but you've got to understand that today in politics particularly, when you decide, you divide. And when you take a decision, whatever it is, you're going to end up with in today's world of social media and so on, you end up with a violent reaction from some people, but that it shouldn't stop you from expressing your point of view, and provided you do it respectfully and provided you're prepared to listen to people. I mean, I'm always happy to debate and listen to people who, profoundly disagree with me. The only thing I don't like is when people either suggest, it's all the result of some conspiracy or dishonesty, or alternatively, I'm not entitled to speak. I mean, I think I'm entitled to speak, but as I say, whether you want to listen to it or agree with it, that's a decision for the other person.
How does the rest of the world regard you? This is a fairly broad question. I'm not expecting you to answer on behalf of everybody, but we've described quite accurately how sections of the British media and the British public will never forgive you for that. The rest of the world gives you a slightly better read.
Well, it's always different when you're out of your own, country in that sense, I think. Obviously the work that I do now with my institute, we're busy in many different countries, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, and it's that's a different situation.
You mentioned Africa, and I wasn't going to ask you about this, but it's very much in the news, this notion of white saviour syndrome. Is that, you've seen the story of the reality, the journalist, I beg your pardon, Stacey Dooley, being accused by David Lammy and others of indulging in something called white saviour syndrome. Is that an accusation that could be levelled at you?
Was it the idea of what if someone who's...
Well, it's a post-colonial idea that you go there and only the white man can fix their problems. That seems to be the narrative in the news this week.
Who's saying that only the white man can fix their problems? Most Africans think their destiny lies in their own hands, but they're certainly the countries I work in, they're perfectly happy to have help.
From anyone?
Yeah.
But you're not across this story, obviously.
No,
you don't read the cheaper print.
No, I am a bit across the story. And actually, I like David Lammy, and he was a good colleague of mine when I was in Parliament, but I mean...
You don't get it?
Look, if you're, for example, what we do is we go and we have teams of people who go and live and work in the country, who, by the way, some of them are local, some of them are from outside, and we try and help those countries deliver change. It might be around electricity or healthcare, education, trying to bring investment into the country, whatever it might be. Well,
and there's very few photo opportunities involved and that sort of thing, which I think is part of the criticism that's levelled at Comic Relief.
We've been, for example, during the Ebola crisis, my team stayed in Sierra Leone, Guinea and Liberia all the way through that and helped them knock it out of personal, risk to themselves. Mm. I don't think anyone in those countries thinks they shouldn't have been there. And some of them were from one ethnic background, some from another. I don't think anyone cares.
You mentioned you liked David Lammy when you were parliamentary colleagues. Did you like Jeremy Corbyn?
I did not like Jeremy Corbyn. I just completely disagreed with him.
Not an answer. Did you like him?
No, I didn't have any. I didn't know him well enough to like or dislike him politically. Obviously, I didn't get on with him, and I think I can't remember how many times he rebelled against the government.
428. Well,
428
under you and Brown.
Wow. It's quite something, actually.
It's pretty impressive. He, of course, is equally tolerant of dissent and criticism. Talk to me about the anti-Semitism. It must sadden you to see the party covered in criticism of that particular ilk.
It doesn't just sadden me, it shocks me, and it's a shameful thing for the Labour Party.
How do you think it's happened?
It's happened because, look, there is a whole series of people with a set of very far left attitudes, some of which are around the foreign policy questions, particularly around Israel, and they've come into the Labour Party. And, you know, the fact is, when I was leader, and actually throughout the 80s and early 90s, you know, John Smith, Neil Kinnock, there was a sort of, the door was locked and barred to those elements with a kind of not welcome sign on the door. And the truth is now, because the leadership is from that tradition, the door's open with a welcome mat. And what's happened is you've had a whole lot of people come in to the Labour Party with these views. And one of them is, it's not that you kind of criticism of the government of Israel. I mean, if you actually go to Israel, which I have an office in Israel and still work there, you know, the Israelis are as critical of their government as anyone else. But when that then trends into criticism of the existence of Israel, or you single out Israel in the Middle East right now, I mean, look, in Syria, 600,000 people have died in the past years. I mean, you know, it's when you single out Israel in this way that it very quickly seeps into anti-Semitism, and that's tragic, actually.
Will it seep out again?
That is a very good question. I hope so. But it's a problem when it derives from a worldview in which, as I say, this criticism of Israel is so excessive that it kind of impacts the whole of your thinking. And so I hope it does, and the Labour Party should take as much action as it possibly can to do it, because it really is, look, it's a horrible thing when you have members of the Jewish community who think that they, you know, if Labour comes to power, it's a risk for them. I mean, that's an unacceptable thing.
You have to, I suppose, conclude that some of the MPs who've recently left the party don't think it is going to seep out anytime soon. So in terms of your personal current political credo, who are you closer to, the independent group or Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party? Well,
in terms of the criticisms they're making around anti-Semitism, of course, with the people at the left, it doesn't mean to say that I want to leave, though, because I've been in the Labour Party for over 40 years. I don't want to suddenly give it up, but I'm completely sympathetic to what they're saying about it.
Do you think more will follow, or do you think the noises he's made in the last week regarding a second referendum will do the job they're designed to do?
I don't think the second referendum is what it's about in the end. I mean, look, I think...
This week's behaviour is, I mean, the defections might be more about anti-Semitism, but stemming the flow is about the people's vote, isn't it?
No? Possibly, but I think it's a more fundamental question than that. And, you know, as I say, personally for me, you know, you can be pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit and still in the Labour Party with either view, but this kind of worldview is the problem. And I don't know whether more people will leave or not. It's just, it's hard to judge. But
is the party under existential threat?
I think the party's got a big issue it's got to resolve, yeah.
So yes, it is.
Existential's a large word.
Well, it is, but in terms of surviving in anything like its current form, it's possible for the first time in your political life that it won't.
I hope it does, and I hope it returns to sanity, but it's a big risk.
Final question. I'm interviewing Ricky Gervais next week. He's the second public figure of immense international importance that I'm going to have.
I'm sure it should have been the other way around.
I'm going to have the pleasure of meeting, but he does this thing, and I was trying desperately to think of common ground between the two, which is just as hard to find as it sounds. But he does this thing where he claims he never wanted to be a public figure. He never wanted to be famous, and it all happened by accident. Except he did, we've subsequently discovered, try rather hard to become a pop star. So did you, sort of.
I did.
So was there a desire for public approval? The look at me gene has been writ large in Tony Blair for forever?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I carefully avoid questions of psychiatric analysis because you never know where they might lead. No, I did. I really was keen on it. I was very, very keen on music and playing in the band. And I was not interested in politics at all until probably I was about 20. And if you told me when I was 18 or 19 I was going to be a politician, I'd have been horrified, actually. Not just surprised, but horrified. And yeah, I don't know. But it's a very interesting thing because it taught me a big lesson in life. That I remember having this conversation with a member of the band, and he was a nice guy, but he was very blunt in his assessment. And he said to me, because we were talking about what we would do in the next stages of the group and everything. And he said to me, look, he said, I've got to be very honest with you. He said, your problem is, it's basically talent or the lack of it. He said, your singing's not really very good and your guitar playing's actually genuinely substandard. And he said, and what's more, he said, I've actually watched you trying, he said, and I don't think any amount of practice is going to improve you. So this is, and he said it in a very sort of kind way, but so that was the moment where I realized that now I didn't immediately then take to politics, but I realized the chances of me becoming a rock star were limited.
Tony Blair, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Cheers.